Hi students, today we are looking at chapter 2 from Transforming Communities. Chapter 2 is The Power of Listening. Community Conversations Make a Difference. And it is on page 19 of the textbook. This chapter focuses on a relatively local group, the Recovery Cafe in San Jose, and they start us off with the Recovery Cafe San Jose group and establishment because it is an example of the power of listening, which is what this chapter is about, these community conversations that we have. And this aligns extensively with points made in chapter 1 about asset-based community building and community strength. And so one way of doing that is by learning to listen and to tell stories. And the motto of the Recovery Cafe San Jose, it's at the bottom of page 19 and carries over to page 20. While you can generally find a cup of coffee at Recovery Cafe San Jose, they offer a lot more than that. They offer hope and dignity and comfort and self-expression. The cost is a willingness to confront one's addictions. And as Recovery Cafe San Jose founder Dana Bainbridge says, we're all recovering from something. So the chapter begins with giving some history about how Recovery Cafe San Jose came into fruition. There's this notion that there is nothing more significant than someone telling their story. And you all might recognize this as well because you might often have noticed in a lot of my grading rubrics for assignments, I encourage you all to share personal reflections or stories or life experiences as a way to take these ideas that you are learning about social justice and apply them to aspects of your own life and to see these connections both within the classroom and outside of the classroom. And so part of the mission of Recovery Cafe is again further discussed at the bottom of page 20 to the top of 21. Part of the mission of Recovery Cafe is the implementation of a healing community model to help people deal with the traumas of homelessness, addiction, and mental health issues. So the origins of the cafe are deeply rooted in issues that the community itself was already dealing with, and specifically a church in which the original building was owned by the First Christian Church of San Jose. So these are issues the church as well was dealing with when the Recovery Cafe model became an idea. And so why was it needed? That's discussed starting at the bottom of page 21. And one of the reasons why the founder, Dana, really felt like the community could benefit from such a space is because of the issues they were dealing with in terms of homelessness, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, mental health issues. Where could we support the well-being of these individuals and utilize a way to help them tell their stories and then work through these hardships? And so, since the church was already doing some of this labor, it made sense for her to reach out in terms of the space and the eventual building of the cafe. Now, there were some challenges that they faced, and that's discussed on page 23. So, one thing was the issues with the homelessness and the housing issue, and the real life repercussions from alcohol and drug abuse addictions. They talk about in this chapter, both our author and different people from the Recovery Cafe San Jose, how they had to deal with the fact that many of the people they were trying to serve were dying from their addictions. And so they hosted memorial services, and they were deeply invested in the community, and yet the implicating it all into the Recovery Cafe model and the ability of the individuals to overcome addictions were hardships that they were dealing with. There was so much heartbreak. So what could they do with it all? Well, they considered two main points. One was that in order for the model of what they were doing to succeed, they had to consider the voices of those being impacted within the community and make sure they were in the center of building such a place. So for instance at the top of page 25, the voices of impacted communities help shape these ministries. Homeless people shaping homeless ministries, jobless people shaping job training program goals, etc. They're not part of the problem, they're part of the solution. They're deeply embedded in the model, and that's part of that strength-based community asset building that was discussed in chapter 1. So it's being implemented here in an actual creation of a place where people can come together. The second thing that they really worked on was funding. And Dana specifically was inspired for this Recovery Cafe from one that was in Seattle. So she saw it working in another community and took points and ideas from that and then was implementing it in San Jose. But then you also have to consider the funding. These kinds of things cost money. And so they worked really heavily to get people from outside the community who wanted to be involved, getting them involved through fundraising opportunities. And they even brought in people from Seattle to help. And then, of course, government funding and all of that. So, in the end, as you're nearing the conclusion of this chapter, I think it's important to understand that in this case, in San Jose, one way the community was fighting systemic inequalities that would allow some people to have homes and other people not to, that would allow some people to have food and others not to, was to get the whole community organizing to fight against the systemic inequalities. Having, for instance, just the one church doing all of this outreach work wasn't enough. They needed it to be an even larger community effort. And so they talk about different organizations within the community that became invested in the cafe and their mission. That's at the bottom of page 27. And even going further to get members from the local university to get involved. That's discussed at the top of page 28. So I think one thing you have to consider, and this was mentioned in the introduction, is that in order to transform our communities and really invest equity and positive changes, it cannot be insular. It cannot just be like the family unit that was the problem in Spain with the example with the Catholic priest, right? He had to find a way to expand it out to the larger community to want to get involved and to know that their labor, their ideas, everything was important and made a difference. And without all of these key points and without listening to the people in the community and letting them be the leaders, none of this with the Recovery Cafe could be possible. And in the end, Dana emphasizes that, and this is in the middle of page 33, I think recovery requires the deepest inner transformation of any process. The people who step into their process of recovery keep stepping into it. They are some of the most resilient, courageous people in the world. They're more real. Nobody's trying to pretend there's something they're not most of the time. They are incredibly real people to be with. And so, as you conclude, there's some really good information in the Learn More section at the end of the chapter about the Recovery San Jose, about the founding directors. There is a really incredible book you could read about the original Recovery Cafe model that was discussed in the chapter about from the one that was located in Seattle. And as usual, if you have questions after reading this chapter, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email.